productive at home, in the community, and at work. Now, it's important to understand that prior to COVID-19, we were really dealing with kind of near epidemic levels of stress, anxiety, loneliness, and depression. And on the next slide, I want to talk a little bit about how almost 20% of us pre-pandemic will really experience some type of mental or behavioral issue this year. Now, this return to work, whatever that might be or look like for your organization, is going to be a little bit of a slow trickle for everybody. And I think anticipatory anxiety might be difficult on some employees. Really, all we're trying to talk about with anticipatory anxiety is what it's referring to is this kind of dwell on the fear of the unknown. And if we know anything about COVID-19, it's packed full of unknowns, so especially regarding this return to work. Now, while emotional well-being is really that ability to practice stress management techniques, be resilient, generate those kind of positive, productive feelings, this anticipatory anxiety is kind of a shift that occurs. That when we're in fear for an extended period of time, that imagined future situation we perceive. In times like this, anxiety may be stirred up, challenging employees' ability to really engage in their emotional well-being. So, on top of all this, our resiliency is being challenged every second of every day. So next slide, we're going to talk a little bit about how we're always on in the modern era, right? Stress is coming at us in more directions than ever before. Perhaps one of the biggest factors threatening our resilience and contributing to stress is seemingly incessant requests for our attention, right? Our modern society has developed an unending appetite for doing more. Perhaps it's self-imposed pressure to perform, or the media always has us on, right? Always available. We're always perpetuating, the expectation to respond, no matter what the hour of the day of the week. We're at home right now, and we walk past, I walk past my office, and I kind of look at my computer and say, well, okay, I might as well do some work. Well, and it's just not enough to just respond and be available right now. We consider those who multitask kind of that, epitome of professional efficiency. However, a lot of research is really demonstrating that, this is really a constant drain on our brains. And this constant seek of attention and this task switching really leads to a lot of brain fatigue. And our human brains are just simply not wired to be able to deal with all this. So as we move through life, certain stressors will resolve, while others will become more prominent over time. And if we don't have these effective coping mechanisms, we can end up suffering in silence. The stress builds, the brain fatigues. It's a perfect setup for stressors to become unmanageable. So let's talk a little bit about stress. And stress, it's really not all created equal. So let's take a closer look at the response of stressors and the connection to mental health. And take a look at this continuum here on the screen. Started on the left-hand side, you have the healthy state. So you have these people in this box are kind of flourishing, right? They have this internal dialogue that really promotes personal success. They're calm, steady. They have, very normal mood fluctuations, physically well rested. They have energy to get through their day. They're in control physically, mentally, and emotionally, right? At the workplace, they're performing well. Now, what are these people doing though? They're consciously maintaining a healthy lifestyle, continuing to identify and nurture their support systems, and really while breaking down problems into kind of really measurable pieces. Shifting over to that next box, we have reacting, right? So here's a person who's not really flourishing. Their well-being is being affected. They're getting by. They might be experiencing some nervous, anxious, irritable feelings. Might have a little bit of trouble sleeping, at times forgetful, maybe trouble concentrating or procrastinating. At the workplace, they may be, late to work frequently or have some negative attitudes. What can be done in this space? Well, you really need to recognize one's limits, implement some self-care, like we're going to talk about today, by engaging healthy coping strategies, identifying and minimizing stressors. Now, shifting to our friend who may be over to injured, right? They're struggling. There's this internal dialogue is really not positive. They're no longer really coping. They have high risk for developing a mental illness. They're likely experiencing anxiety, anger, or hopelessness, really noticeably fatigued, impaired decision-making. At the workplace, their performance is probably some pretty significant issues going on there. And also in maybe safety sensitive workplaces, they show an increase in kind of accidental injuries due to distraction in some cases. So what can be done? Well, we need to identify and understand our own signs of distress and seek rather than continuing or just seek help, rather than continuing or plugging along or further isolating ourselves. Then we have illness, right? So this is a diagnosis or loss of function. The symptoms will vary here. You cannot concentrate or perform duties. This is where you really need to seek help, recommendations from a medical professional. And so I wanted to draw your attention to is that by being aware of our responses, to stress, we're better positioned to really earlier on to take meaningful action to positively influence our mental health. But what if our perception of stress is really affecting all this? So on the next slide, there really used to be a school of thought that all stress was toxic. Well, that's really not the case, and that the old school of thought that eliminating all kind of stress was how you should be perceiving this. But in the last decade, there really has been a tremendous amount learned about stress, and that how we can each experience the same stress and respond to it differently. So the illustration on this slide here really demonstrates this ongoing process. You have both negative and positive stimuli bringing to our attention every day. So how we process or think of these stimuli will really drive these micro decisions and behaviors, which result in our reaction or our emotional state, which can be more negative or positive, right? Ultimately, over time, this impacts whether we have an improved satisfaction or diminished life satisfaction. So now let's quickly use COVID-19 as an example here. We've all had more negative than positive stimuli coming at us, right? Most of us are stretched thin at work, at home, working at home, more hours, tighter timelines, less resources, maybe lower budgets. We've heard it all, right? Our perception of this situation, though, might drive thoughts such as, what's going to happen to my job? Why do we have to work this way? This isn't right. How do I do my job under the circumstance? So that's our perception in this kind of negative context. Our reaction, we become less engaged. We start making kind of short-sighted decisions. We start putting fires out and pulling out of teamwork. So this may include seeking others around who also have this negative lens, maybe creating some sort of gossip that really induces this kind of toxic workplace. The impact of this, well, our emotional state is going to be a little bit more negative, right? Over time, this diminished life satisfaction is going to follow us home, or it's going to affect our physical health. It's going to affect our energy and the ability to make these positive decisions as well. On the flip side of this, or alternatively, if we have personal resilience exists and is leveraged in this scenario instead, has the possibility of kind of going into different directions. So the idea of people are actually thriving through this situation and not just surviving, right? Same as before, we'd likely have a little bit more negative stimuli. We all have more negative stimuli coming at us than positive right now. More work, tighter timelines, everything like that, okay? Our perception of this situation might drive the same thoughts, though. Job insecurity, frustration may come to the surface, right? But we have to be aware of these thoughts. So if we choose to identify what is in our control and what is not, so really it's that old thing, control the controllables, right? Maybe seeking clarity, taking time to talk to your leader or obtain transparency as it relates to priorities and really guide your work or focus. So the reaction to this perception is one of adaptation, really consciously implementing these coping strategies to maintain our physical and mental health, making things a little bit more manageable, stay in that headspace where we can really problem solve, stay engaged in a meaningful way at home and at work. The impact of this is really a higher life satisfaction, right? In the second scenario is going to be drastically better than the first example, as we're being aware of our perception and formulating an appropriate reaction to that. So I want to dig a little bit deeper and chat about what we can actually all do about all this. So how can we maybe use our knowledge of science to change the perception or even more our reactions to drive productivity? So as it turns out, what underlines all these areas on the screen here, well, it's our brain. And though we sometimes don't think it, we actually can adjust our brain to drive productivity of neurochemicals, which can really in turn helpfully avoid some of these pitfalls that we see on the screen. So several decades ago, the way chemicals interact with the brain was a mystery. It wasn't till about, I think, the 1950s that neurochemistry became actually a legitimate or recognized field of study. So today we know that there's a lot known, but still a lot unknown about how the brain chemistry works. But many situations can trigger neurotransmitters. But instead of us being in the passenger seat all the time and just letting these neurotransmitters drive us, there are ways we can kind of intentionally make some of these flow. And understanding how to voluntarily trigger the release of these neurotransmitters can really be key in providing productive or being more productive in the workplace. So let's talk a little bit about neurotransmitters. How can we use neuroscience to revolutionize the workplace? Well, seems like a bit of a crazy idea, but it turns out we're kind of already doing it. We just kind of need to formalize it a little bit. So today I want to talk to you a little bit about the science behind this. What's going on in our brains and how do we drive productivity? Happy people are more motivated and productive. Now, I'll leave this idea of positive psychology to another expert at another day. And today I just want to talk about a kind of a quartet of neurochemicals on your screen here that are responsible for driving happiness and productivity, and how we can really trigger the release of these neurotransmitters to allow our bodies to be in the driver's seat, right, that I talked about, instead of just being in the passenger on life. Now, the body is wired to avoid pain and really move towards pleasure and happiness. So in response to this, our brains release neurotransmitters to guide these decisions. But what are neurotransmitters? Well, again, our brains are wired with billions of neurons. Some of them look like the ones on the screen, right? And of course, there's other auxiliary cells in the brain as well, and spinal cord. My thesis was actually on microglia, and these are the immune cells of the CNS, but we'll talk about that on another webinar as well. But these billions of neurons are constantly changing and growing to ensure they drive our everyday responses. Now, most of these neurons actually don't touch each other. They form chemicals. They don't touch each other. They use chemical signals to kind of interact with one another and to kind of what we call propagate their messages to move forward into these higher brain orders or higher order functioning areas of the brain to really drive outputs in your body. Now, there's many different neurochemicals we could talk about today. I'm going to talk today about 4 and their role in creating productive, happy employees. So dopamine is your kind of primary motivating reinforcement neurotransmitter. Serotonin is often heard of in the context of mental health and is really key in is a key chemical targeted in a lot of antidepressants. Oxytocin, probably most known for its role in childbirth, actually is released in males and females and is a really key neurochemical related into trust. And then finally, endorphins. It's a form of endogenous opioid that acts in our body, which basically acts as a natural analgesic. So how can we tap into these? Let's dive right in and take a first look at dopamine. So when dopamine is low, so is motivation. And it may also be one of the most studied neurotransmitters there is as well. Dopamine really has been in the forefront of neuropsychological fields of memory, sleep, mood, and pleasurable reward for a long time. We've all felt this way too. Lack of enthusiasm, procrastination, self-doubt sometimes. All these can actually be related to a little bit lower levels of dopamine. And there's been ample studies that say surging your dopamine levels can really drive motivation of a person towards their goals. So there's a big seesaw effect here, though. Too low, you have this kind of deleterious effects of dopamine, and then too high, you maybe become overly euphoric, right? So as I said, our brains are kind of hardwired to reinforce this pleasure of dopamine, and dopamine has a major role to play in this. So there's ample research showing, animals with blocked or lower levels of dopamine usually opt for, the less rewarding options, while those with higher levels of dopamine actually will exert the satisfactory effort needed to get to the kind of the higher reward. So this is interesting. So this kind of sounds like maybe the working world a little bit, right? So as an employee, or just generally as a person, there are unique ways to really increase your dopamine levels and really drive that mood state. And to give you the motivation to get that reward, whatever you deem that to be. So my first piece of advice today is going to be to break your goals into tasks, or break your goals or tasks into smaller pieces. and celebrate those smaller victories. So let me tell you a quick story. So my PhD took me 5 years. It was long, hard, trying, so many ups and downs. You can ask my wife. I finally hit that finish line, right? And my family and friends were excited to celebrate. They're excited to get that old mic back, right? But I was completely done. The PhD was, was hard, but I envisioned myself celebrating a bit too afterwards. And so I got home from my defense and I completely crashed. I was out of it for weeks. I couldn't get anything done around my house. I had a terrible time with my thesis revisions. What normally would take me minutes was taking me hours, and I just had a complete lack of motivation. There was seemingly, I couldn't do anything. So obviously I researched into this. And what I found was it's actually kind of an extremely natural, it was, what I was feeling was extremely natural. What it was called is, it's called dopamine fatigue or dopamine hangover. And when they said I passed, I kind of popped that bottle of champagne, had a little bit of fun, right? I was celebrating with I felt like I landed on the moon. But the higher the highs, sometimes the lower the lows. And I went into a little bit of a massive slump that took me months to get out of in a productivity and motivation sense. So what can we do about that dopamine fatigue? Well, instead of having one big goal like I had, my goal was to get out of the lab and get into the real world at all costs. Instead of this, you can break your goals into a series of finish lines and really encourage frequent but less volume release of dopamine. And celebrate these little finish lines. So, once you hit a goal, get a growler of beer or go to a hockey game with your friends when we can again, and celebrate when you meet a pursuable goal. But make sure that you create a new goal prior to finishing the previous. So you have something new to drive towards and a new reward to look forward to. This will keep your dopamine levels higher, but actually higher for a longer period of time. And you really will drive your motivation and your production to achieving these goals. So though I failed at some of the, that kind of goal setting task, I guess, in my PhD, there was a few things that did help me. So one of them, for a little bit more of a surge of dopamine, was listening to music, right? Music with no lyrics. So save those kind of rock outs for your car and for another day. But if you're working and you can't have that motivation to keep going, listening to music without lyrics for about 15 to 20 minutes can actually really encourage dopamine in the reward center of your brain, very similar to eating something that you like or smelling something pleasant. So it works. So give it a try next time you're lacking a little bit of motivation. So if you're an employer, leader or HR manager, recognizing the accomplishments of your employees, sending them an encouraging email. I received an email the other day from a colleague of mine. There's no text in the email, just a video clip in the email saying, thank you. I'm just checking in with you and thanks for all the hard work. That surge of dopamine really makes me want to run through a wall for that person. And dopamine really is why. And when there is a reward at the end, this tonic release of dopamine really will ensure you to get to that reward. Set your goals, set triggers, visualize, and these tasks and get these dopamine flowing. Attach rewards to goals. This will really keep you driving and motivating towards the goals you set. So I'm going to move on to serotonin now. Probably one of the most mentioned neurotransmitters there is. Serotonin is known as the happiness hormone. But I don't think everybody fully maybe appreciates how it can alter your mood. First, it's responsible for regulating anxiety, and the lack of serotonin can actually lead to numerous mental and behavioral conditions as well. Serotonin is an inhibitory neurotransmitter, though. So unlike dopamine, it does not have a direct stimulatory effect on the brain. But when levels are high, you drive satisfaction. A person who has a good balance of serotonin can feel significant or important. When serotonin levels are low, loneliness and depressive-like symptoms may kick in. That's actually how antidepressants work. I feel like we've all heard of SSRIs. Well, that's selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. And really what this is doing is basically these drugs keep serotonin in that synapse that we talked about earlier for a longer period of time. Now, we all have levels of serotonin. This is genetic, and what can we do to actually promote it? Well, here's kind of kind of a funny story about your brain. It's actually easy for us to trick our brain. Think about that for a second. Our brain is kind of a hard time, a difference between what is real and what we're imagining. So, in fact, so there's studies that show that when you are when you're perceiving something, or if you're just imagining something, it actually both can drive the similar release of serotonin. So if you need a boost of serotonin, you're having a tough day, or you're sick of hearing me ramble on, just think about something, some of your past achievements, the time that you won Employee of the Quarter, or you won a hockey tournament as a child. And this is actually another reason why gratitude is such a powerful tactic as well. Actually, this is kind of a good time for this. Let's take a quick break and let's talk about gratitude quickly. I want everybody to grab a piece of pen and a paper, and really let's talk about, despite all the negatives in the world right now, there are also some the benefits to the experience that we're going through and being at home. And I want you to grab a piece of paper and a pen and really write the word gratitude on it. So gratitude is a character strength that is very connected with happiness. And when you're going through a difficult time, attending to what's good in your life can really shift your perspective and decrease negative emotions. Sometimes, though, it's very hard to see the good when all the conversations we have are kind of negative. So I want you to take 30, 45 seconds and reflect on some things that you're grateful for. Maybe you're grateful for your children's teachers. Maybe you're grateful for frontline workers. Maybe it's your neighbor down the street that brought you cookies last weekend. That may or may not have happened to me. So I'll give you 30 seconds to write down a few things that you are grateful for. All right. Now, I want you to take a good look at this list. And remember to focus on positive things. And gratitude, no matter how, no matter how small things are, they're immediate, gratitude is an immediate mood booster and can really increase that charge of your internal battery, or increase serotonin levels or your mood. So actually try adding this to your daily routine too. Gratitude is a very powerful resiliency tool that can really increase serotonin levels in the brain, which can actually alter our mood state quite quickly. So maybe keep a journal for yourself as well. So if you're having a tough day and having a tough time thinking about something you're grateful for as well, you can flip through these pages and kind of imagine those pieces on gratitude, and you can actually promote a surge of dopamine in this way. So what can you do as an employer? Well, as an employer, maybe there's another way that you can, so as an employer, you can kind of promote your employees to get outside. So serotonin is actually, can be boosted through sunlight. So our skin absorbs UV rays. UV then is a precursor to kind of creating vitamin D. Vitamin D ultimately produces serotonin. So of course, there's a balance. Please don't spend all your time in the sunshine. 20 minutes a day of UV light is actually very good at boosting your levels of serotonin. I want to tell just a very quick story on Steve Jobs here quickly. So I think he might have had this all figured out before a lot of us did. So Steve Jobs is probably one of the most creative people we've maybe ever come across in our lifetimes, right? And so he was often seen outside walking around the Apple campus with some of his employees. And so people, of course, started to dive into, what's the, how was he so creative and successful? And really what it turned out to be, or maybe this is part of it, is he was outside because he knew that UV rays could increase serotonin levels. Also, what he did know, that the actual act of walking engages these motor neurons, which these motor neurons can then be precursor, or can drive tryptophan, which then tryptophan also can lead to the production of serotonin. But also, when you're walking outside, your brain goes into what is called theta waves. Now, that's another topic for another webinar as well. I'm not going to dive deep into this, but I think what he did find was a trifecta of creativity. So he ensured these higher release of serotonin by UV rays, by just the act of walking and driving creativity through these theta waves as well. So I think maybe it's something to get outside, promote your employees to go on walking meetings or just go out for a coffee break, and that's another way to drive. So trick your brain, think of victories, get outside and move, be grateful. All these will really produce that happiness hormone and hopefully increase your productivity. So let's move on to oxytocin. So oxytocin is actually known as the cuddle hormone, and maybe we're going to talk a little bit less about cuddling today and a little bit more about, relationships in a professional context. So oxytocin is a hormone released in a very small area of the brain called the hypothalamus. And when it really makes people feel bonded, and this neurochemical is the foundation of kind of driving trust and can be very powerful in getting teams to work together for a common purpose. So oxytocin is, like I said, powerful for intimacy, empathy, cordiality. Both men and women do release oxytocin, and it's probably most noted in childbirth, like I said earlier. And it's also noted in that kind of motherly bond that mothers have with their children. But in fact, it's actually fundamental for both men and women and their bond they have with children and their colleagues. So, but what are some ways that we can increase this? So oxytocin is really powerfully stimulated through touch or handshakes or hugs. So maybe not something that we can be doing right now that much. So what are some other ways? Well, there's actually also some very interesting articles currently that on our lack of oxytocin release right now. So these micro connections that we usually get with strangers day to day, by maybe just simply a handshake are not there right now. So that we're having a little bit of this is having a crux on maybe our anxiety and loneliness. So another way to kind of do this is instead of these in-person kind of connections and touch is actually through video chatting. And I know a lot of us have been doing that, but it is about 80% as effective. So taking a few minutes at the beginning of your chats, though, to really connect with the person, ask them how they're feeling, try to drive an emotional connection with them. Also, some other ways too, if you are comfortable with your family and friends on virtual meetings, is dancing and singing with them on these virtual meetings actually has been shown to drive these oxytocin levels as well. So we're going to be afraid to shake hands for a while. That's okay, but maybe we stick to our virtual dance parties for now, I guess. Also back in, I think it was 2017, there was an article on the Harvard Business Review on the neuroscience of trust. And that article really highlighted a study that was looking how a company's culture can be actually affected, how their culture affects their productivity. So there's plenty of experiments in humans that show, our natural inclination to trust each other, or rodents actually use oxytocin to signal to each other that it's safe to approach. So, this particular study actually wanted to look at trustworthiness. So trust and its kind of, reciprocation, trustworthiness. So how this study broke down was there was two people. There was a sender and a recipient, and the sender can send an amount of money to the recipient, and the amount of money would triple if the sender was to send it to the recipient, right? And that recipient can then share that money or keep it all for themselves. Now, the experiment drew blood from both the sender and the recipient before and after the protocol would happen. And what was found is that the more money people received, the more trust that they had on the part of the sender, right? So the more oxytocin the brain actually produced. Also, on the other side of this, the higher the amount of oxytocin from the sender was correlated how likely that sender was to send money in the first place, right? So it turns out there's a series of beautifully defined experiments that oxytocin basically reduced the fear of us trusting a stranger. A couple more powerful kind of tactics employers can use to drive that kind of team-first mentality is really recognizing excellence. Another way is to actually induce what we call challenge stress. So if a manager assigns an employee or a group with a difficult but achievable within their skill set task, that kind of medium stress that they're seeing can actually really drive oxytocin within that group or just that person, and can really intensify that group's focus and strengthen their social connectedness together. So, and again, working in high trust cultures, is a proven remedy to employee engagement and burnout and almost all and productivity as well. And so there's a quote I want to just kind of end this section with. That a CEO is once quoted by saying, "A leader is responsibility is to define reality. The last thing is to say thank you. In between that, the leader must become a servant. Now create a culture of trust and define goals, then get out of the way and let oxytocin run the rest," right? All right, and finally, I'm going to talk about endorphins. So if you want to kind of relieve anxiety, which can really block productivity, get those endorphins pumping, right? So endorphins are really released in response to pain or stress, and actually are quite potent at alleviating anxiety and depression. So I think we've all heard it before, getting our second wind or this runner's high thing. So basically what is happening is kind of similar. The activity that we're doing promotes the release of endorphins, which are then used to mitigate our perception of pain. So I guess we'll take a step back. So the word endorphin actually comes from endogenous. So endo meaning endogenous or meaning within the body, and orphans, which is actually in regards to morphine. So endorphin is actually endogenous morphine. And there's about 20 different types of endorphins in humans. Beta endorphin is one of the most studied that there is. But let's not confuse endorphins with our friends. Dopamine is really released to motivate us to really accomplish that goal, while endorphins are actually released to, kind of relieve pain. So if you're a runner, releasing endorphins kind of reduces that pain while you're running. But interestingly, it's all kind of connected. So the endorphins kind of then are released in the reward center of the brain, which then release dopamine that kind of causes all that runner's high. I think it's kind of a good time to take a step back and really talk about how none of this, what I'm talking about today, happens in a vacuum, right? This is a very complex system, and these messages are all interplaying with each other. And I just want to show the science behind some of these. Of course, just go back to endorphins. One way that we can kind of induce the release of endorphins is, of course, exercise. Another way is actually laughter. Laughter is an extremely powerful promoter of endorphins, and much like other chemicals above, just us kind of, tricking, or the expectation of laughter is very potent in driving endorphins. Comedy shows, having a sense of humor at work, being professionally jovial as I like to call it, it can really keep your mood up, but also keep your mood of your coworkers around. So also studies show that dark chocolate, spicy foods, aromatherapy, vanilla, lavender especially, really drive that release of endorphins as well. So make sure you keep some of that, that drawer of secret dark chocolate in your desk. As an employer, encouraging or endorphin release through, office parties or picnics, these are powerful ways. But of course, right now we can't be doing these kind of things. So another way is actually by promoting generosity. So it turns out there's a pretty interesting study that was done at Carnegie Mellon that looked at hypertension and volunteerism. And so people who volunteered for up to 4 hours a week were less likely to develop hypertension. Now, it turns out that the mechanism behind all of this is this release of endorphins. So generosity actually seems to arouse this release of endorphins. So as a leader, you can promote volunteerism in your organization, sponsor a charity event, get your team involved. Your brain loves kindness, and so being a good person actually can help you guys reap the rewards as well. And remember, it's all connected. This pandemic really has taken a toll on all of us, and perhaps something that we didn't really realize when this first hit is the virus is scary, but so is quarantine, and your colleagues and friends you may interact with every day can really help fuel your energy and productivity. They might not be around right now. So really all I wanted to do today was give you some tools to develop resilience, and as you can see here, it really is all connected. And by increasing your performance, maybe through some of the tips and tricks that I said today, you can really be more engaged workforce, and remembering to trust and have a purpose or mutually reinforce one another can promote this happiness as well. And when employees are happy and they're doing purposeful driven work, they're more engaged employees, and they're more, more engaged employees really drives resilience. And so it's back to that kind of idea of thriving, not just surviving. I just want to end today's conversation on a little bit of a discussion on resilience. So resilience is that ability to withstand, recover, and grow in the face of changing demands. So this is, if we go to the next slide, think of resilience as like a tree. And I love this analogy. You have your roots firmly in the ground. You can bend, in the face of a storm or a hurricane or whatever you want to relate COVID to. You might lose a couple leaves along the way, but you're not going to break. What else do we know about resilience? Well, the lower levels of resilience can really increase your potential for burnout, can cause loneliness, can increase the likelihood of getting sick, another last thing we need right now. But on the upside, we all have resilience, and we just have different amounts of it. And some of us purely by genetics are more resilient, but all of us can enhance our resiliency really by focusing on the well-being and building these social and interpersonal connections. It will not only, so it's resilient employees, really create resilient organizations. And I hope some of these tools today can help you as an employee or a leader drive your personal well-being and really create a culture of resilience at your company or at home. But how do we operationalize all of this? So much like when you're on an airplane, put your oxygen mask on first before assisting others. And on the next slide is managers and team leaders, we often have to model positive behaviors ourselves. And if we don't have a supervisory role, it's okay. You can have a positive influence on your colleagues at work as well. So much like people remember their favorite teachers with love or gratitude, the opposite could be true through a crisis like this. And it really can cause a lasting organizational effect. So remember, resilient organizations are characterized by strong leadership, their ability to adapt to these changing environments, demonstrating that professionalism through times of crisis like we're going through. And none of this should really change through this pandemic, and whatever's next for your organization is leaders must really understand that their behaviors will really have a lasting impact on their workforce, and people who feel supported or motivated are really going to be equipped to thrive. And finally, on the last slide, have a sense of urgency with all of this. With the world shifting literally minute by minute, we urge all of our clients and their employees to really implement strategies to build organizational well-being and resilience in this especially digital workplace. And remember, it starts with you guys being a role model in this change. Focus on your most important assets, your people, and yourselves, right? A single strategy is not going to work. Be agile and consistent. Make sure your leadership really is embodying that culture of the organization, and that their messages really do match their behaviors. And, the whole person really does come to work every day. So let's make sure we're practicing well-being to be the best person we can be at work, at home, and in the community. That's all for me. So I'd like to shift it back over to Wendy, and maybe there's some questions that we can get to.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Mike. That was really fascinating. And certainly as a physician, we see the interaction of all these neurochemistry reactions that are going on in our brain and how they affect us. So I think it was great how you just brought that into the practicals of the here and now and what we can do. So we do have some questions. So I'm going to throw a few out at you and still put them in the chat section if there's something else that's come up as the presentation went along. So one that's come in, Mike, is what supplements are good to help with my mood?
That's a good question. I mean, first and foremost, I think we got to step back and, if you are having issues or problems through any of this, today was not meant to be in lieu of any sort of pharmacological intervention that you're currently ongoing. But, obviously have those open and honest conversations with medical professionals like yourself, Wendy. But, you have to remember that supplements don't go through the rigors of, clinical trials that a lot of these other pharmacological interventions have, right? There is no doubt that some of them are going to be effective in some circumstances. But I don't think just taking a supplement in a silo and not maybe using some of the tips and tricks that I talked about today will be effective. But there is a couple of supplements. So one of them, I kind of talked about this, vitamin D, really is a precursor to driving kind of a serotonin production. A protein-rich diet actually has some effects on dopaminergic levels as well. And there has actually been some research into tryptophan as well as being another, that's a precursor of serotonin as well. So these may elevate the levels of serotonin. So Wendy, is there anything else that I should add here in this one?
Well, I certainly agree with you. I think using non-pharmaceutical methods is always a great way to start. And the things that we can do ourselves, a lot of the things you talked about earlier in your presentation, how to raise our own serotonin levels, our own dopamine levels. Obviously, there are times where things do become quite depleted and it's beyond what we can do on our own. And that's when, talking to your family doctor, your primary care provider, and that's where some of our medications, one of the originals being Prozac and many of the SSRIs and SNRIs that have come since then. So those are available to help when we need something beyond that. But always, great to start with what you've talked about. And if we can mitigate things right up front and never get to that point, how great is that?
It's almost like triaging yourself, right?
Right, exactly. So another question, Mike, how can we help people who may struggle with feeling unsafe when they return to work?
That's a really good question. Yeah, there's a lot of avenues you can go with that one. Unsafe. I mean, I think if you're feeling unsafe, first step is to have an open and honest conversation with your managers. Please describe why you feel unsafe. If you are being productive at home already, maybe there's a great time to have a discussion with your managers and say, hey, maybe there's something that we can do to continue that I work at home, or have those open and honest discussions. Your employers will be going through a lot of return to work checklists themselves, and they will have to have the rigors to make sure that their workplace is in order, right? But if you are feeling unsafe, I think having that discussion with your employers, being open and honest, is going to be step one of this transition, whatever that's going to look like.
Mm-hmm. And we see people that kind of go both ways. Some people really wanting to get back to the office, that they're missing that routine and that connection. And others, I've got another question here. I'm way more productive working at home. How can I be productive getting back to the office?
Yeah, I think we need to brainstorm of why you're being more productive at home, right? So again, taking that step back, it's almost like that perception and reaction idea. But maybe we start taking a little bit of a journal of, what are you doing at home that's making you more productive? Maybe there's a way to talk to your manager to create that flexibility in your schedule too, right? Maybe tracking your sentiments of, this is what I did all day. This is why I was productive. And then think about your time back at work and say, well, I would have been pulled away in the meeting here or here. And, these are different ways. So trying to, experiment on yourself and track this experiment as well. I guess, we also talked a little bit about listening to music, creating these small goals and setting a schedule for yourself, and sticking to it. Routines really, really do help. And so, this is, again, a lot of people, the workplace is going to change, depending on where you're working. And I think talk to your manager, arm yourself with some reasons that why you feel you are more productive at home. And I think these are conversations will go quite well.
Absolutely. Can you suggest, first of all, how can I train my brain to be happy? Can we train our brains to be happy?
Hopefully I brought up a little bit of that in the conversation today. I think being resilient really is going to be the first step to that. So really trying to, don't let negative stimuli push you off, right? Maybe being grateful, driving the serotonin release in our body, being a positive person. Not all stress is created equal. We got to find ways to be more positive in situations, right? And really think about your coping strategies to maintain your mental and physical health. And making things a little bit more manageable and staying in that headspace where you can problem solve. I think these are all areas where we can kind of train our brain to be happy. And then these will lead to production, and these will lead to motivation, right? So.
Do you suggest a daily routine to get high dopamine endorphin levels sustaining? What would be a good daily routine?
I think so. I mean, this is where Tim Ferriss, I feel like, made all of his money. So I think it's about experimenting on yourself, right? Maybe it's you for 1 week you do the same thing every day, and you see how that week went, and keep yourself a journal and see how it goes. And maybe for you it works to work out at 5 a.m. before everybody's up in your house. Maybe it works. I like to work out kind of after work, because that's when my time is to kind of release what happened during the day. So it's about finding what's right for you. And I think that's the key to all of this. I gave you some tips and tricks. Setting the schedule, setting a routine, sticking to it is very, very key to all of this. I think one more thing too. No, I think that's pretty good.
If we look at, I think we had a webinar previously as well on sleep, but somebody actually asked a question: if I've got some activities that take me kind of later in the evening, are we better to get up at that same time, keep that routine, or just get the same number of hours of sleep a night and not worry about the routine? What do you find with brain chemistry? And I know this is getting a little more into melatonins and some of those other chemicals, but
this is sleep is a little bit outside of my wheelhouse, that's for sure. Yeah. But I think if we even just take sleep out of it, I think just patterns are very key in your brain. I think that's key. But like I said earlier, experiment on yourself, right? If you go, let's say 1 month where you stick to that routine, then the next month try it on. You can if you have the flexibility, you can wake up whenever you would like. Try that. Try sleeping in and how that works for you after that night. But I want to make sure that you track not just the next day, it's 2-3 days later, right? These are sustainable things that happen over time, especially in regards to sleep.
I have a question for you. You mentioned a little bit about fadeaways earlier. So tell us a bit about, you were saying reduce the fadeaways.
Fadeaways, sorry?
When you were talking about increasing some of our neurochemistry and sort of not getting into the fadeaways. I wasn't sure what you meant by that.
Oh, I don't know.
Maybe I misunderstood.
I said that. Yeah. No.
That's okay.
If I said fadeaways, I'm sorry.
Okay. Not a problem. But
yeah.
Another thing, people are saying, I've enjoyed working at home this long and I don't really want to go back to the office. What can I do now to kind of get back in that headspace, get back into the routine?
Yeah, that's a really good one. It just like your shift 2 working at home, I bet you it's going to be another shift back, right? I think change management is kind of the common theme of what we're going through lately. But maybe it's about developing that routine for yourself, right? Maybe it's about even before you go back to work, if you have to go back to work, right? Again, this goes back to the first question of maybe it's talking to your manager that you did like working at home, and maybe just be honest and open and tell them about that. And maybe they will be flexible and empathetic. If your job does kind of mandate you to be at home though, be back in the office when it first opens up, maybe it's about tricking that brain again, right? So maybe it's about developing 2 to 3 weeks before you're going to go back, get up, have your coffee, shower, whatever your kind of routine is, and actually physically leave the house. And then, or get into your car too, and then come back into your house and go directly to your office and start working. This actually tricks your brain and could be in some sort of different or similar-ish pattern to what you're going to be going back to work on too. So just maybe a trick there as well.
Absolutely. There's certainly lots of new, I'm sure when you were doing your studies way back when and studying neurochemistry, we wouldn't be thinking about this in terms of a pandemic, but it's just so interesting to see how all of these reactions and brain chemistries and some of our emotional responses and anxieties and the, all of those things are activated by some of the stresses and things people are undergoing now. And
I think,
normal workplace routines have been so disrupted.
yeah, and kind of like I mentioned earlier in this too, this is not going to be like a light switch, right? So, like, there's no on off here. We're not going back to work and everything will be normal, right? This past few months it's gonna leave scars on people. And I think if you're an employee, you have to self-recognize maybe what some of these scars might be, and start maybe developing tactics to hopefully, help with some of them. As an employer or a leader, you have to realize that, some of your employees may struggle when they first come back, and you really need to really develop methods to kind of support them. Maybe lay out, mental health support that your company has. Maybe it's all of these different areas, right? So, and make it easier on your employees to kind of access these support systems as well. So there's going to be a lot of change going on.
Absolutely. Another question came in. What measures should my employers take to ensure we're safe when we return to work? And I think I'll take a little bit on that. We've done a couple of talks on these topics over the last month or so. But so much depends on the industry you're in. Whether we're looking at a work camp, an office setting, a factory setting. A lot of our public health advisory is getting quite specific in laying out a number of measures that are important to take as you return to work. But I think one of the most important things would be just to connect with your HR group, your manager, and just see how they are supporting you as you return to work. I think even though we're seeing some of the public health restrictions open up now and we're seeing businesses open, we still have to continue those basics of the social advisories, social distancing, ensuring there's hand hygiene stations, not touching our faces, having the workplace set up that way, having policies and all of those different measures in place so that you do feel safe and supported in your workplace setting. And there are some very specific guidelines coming out for specific industries as these times go on as well. So, well, I really want to thank you so much, Mike, for such a fascinating presentation. I think it's just so interesting to see how that science comes and supports a lot of our actions and the reactions that are taking place right now and some of the measures to put in place to help us. So I just want to really take the time to say thank you for that. It gives us lots to think about as we return to work.
Yeah, thank you too. That was pretty fun to dive back into that and get it back into the PhD mindset for a bit. So thank you.
Absolutely. So I just want to remind everybody, I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't remind everybody how important it is to, as we open up, continue with those public health advisories that we know about, and they're becoming mantras, but they're important. So continue with hand hygiene, social distancing, non-medical masks if you're not able to do that. Keep yourself safe. And remember to share positive images and positive thoughts at our hashtag Wello community. That's something we can do to help all boost our endorphins and dopamine. So thank you so much for participating today, and we hope to see you again. Take care.